Hello, my name is Karen Power, and I'm so happy to be here with you today as part of Insights 2023. There are so many practitioner stories in the room. There are so many leaders willing to share their expertise. And it truly is a journey that we're all on to improve schools and to improve student achievement. So right now we're going to talk about knowing your impact as an instructional leader, how important that work is to all of us. And it truly is a pleasure to work with you. I feel strongly about helping others grow and definitely wanting others to share their expertise. So this session will include times for you to turn and talk and a few times for us to share out. We want to ensure that the gift of all of our expertise and our learning today helps all of us grow as leaders. I have been a teacher and vice principal, principal, superintendent in the Moncton area. Most of my career was spent there. And then I went on to be a consultant. So pleased to work with the Learning Bar as we grow confident learners and build a leadership academy. So principals from Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario have been part of this work. And I am really honored to be with the Learning Bar and doing this work as well. One of the things that I've noticed and definitely learned in my travels and in my work is that it really isn't about right or wrong. And sometimes we get into a little bit of an excuse game and perhaps blame game where we're sort of thinking that, we've done things right or wrong, or things are good or bad for schools. And we know that that does not grow a mindset that's positive about school improvement. The focus that we truly need to be about is just getting better for our students. And so that student learning focus has certainly been part of all the conversations today. And we want to continue to focus on that being about high levels of learning for all students. So student by student, skill by skill, how do we improve learning and grow students? And certainly as leaders, how do we do that by growing adults as well? So the adult learners and the student learners become such a focus of our work. We'll talk about the value of intentionality when we think about building instructional leadership. We will explore some strategies that support your shift from management to instructional leadership as part of this journey that you're on to be better leaders. And how do we create opportunities to use evidence to inform next steps as you lead schools, districts, boards, provincial improvement? We do know that there is a need to be evidence-driven, but we also need a balance of how we use that evidence as instructional leaders. So we'll talk about that and definitely explore those possibilities. A great quote that I like to go back to from time to time is to think about how we as leaders need to focus on the right work. And so Dr. Robert Eaker has said it pretty clearly for all of us in talking about the relatively short amount of time that leaders do the right things for the right reasons and definitely in the right ways, make school improvement happen. We see significant positive gains when we truly are focused on that right work and we understand what that work is. And so part of being an instructional leader certainly is having good knowledge of what that looks like and sounds like, and how do we improve our practices around those pieces. One of the shifts we know that should happen when we're truly leading a shift to success is that we as leaders need to understand what is happening in our schools and classrooms. We have to be truly leading that shift to success, and to lead it, we've got to understand how our school or our province or our districts are truly evolving. And then we need to really understand what effective classroom instruction looks like and sounds like. So how do we do intentional observations and support teacher learning by giving good feedback? Leading a shift to success truly is focused on that core instruction. And so really getting better at understanding good classroom practice and really strong literacy, especially literacy instruction in terms of the work we've been doing, is critically important. And then, of course, there needs to be time for instructional conversations. So we have to understand what that shift is going to look like, and how do we truly bring about a shift in instruction through conversation. We need to be able to help others understand what that looks like. And so getting better at spending your time in these areas of gaining knowledge, truly understanding your instructional expectations, and then having conversations and supporting teachers through those conversations is a big piece of shifting to that success that you want to have. In the Alberta Leadership Quality Standard, one of the leadership standards talks about quality teaching and optimum learning for all school students. And so having a good understanding of what quality teaching looks like and how you help teachers with that is part of instructional leadership. It's very difficult to send teachers off for training, to buy programs, to buy curriculum, and not fully understand how that should look when it's deeply implemented. So creating those opportunities for learning for both adults and students is truly a part of that quality learning. In Ontario, we see that there were some surveys done, and this was post-COVID. So principals talked about how they were spending their time. And for the most part, there were, 30.5% of the principals said that they were happy with how they spent their time. But truly, if you look down at the bottom of this slide, there were some places they wanted to dedicate more time. And so all of those really build on that instructional leadership piece. So 75% of the principals said they wanted to increase their classroom walkthroughs. 74.5% said they want to spend more time in curriculum and instructional leadership. And then, of course, also building on their own professional development at 74%. So they wanted to spend less time in the places that they would see as management. Student discipline, attendance came up strongly, and definitely doing paperwork, school board committees, administrative directives. They wanted to shift their focus to those three on the bottom of the screen, including that instructional leadership piece. So it's truly not about wanting to do this differently. It's really about helping others find a way to make that happen. So just ask you to take a moment and turn and talk to somebody next to you in the room and think about what instructional leadership means to you. When you see that phrase, when you see it in an article that you're going to read, or you hear about it in a webcast, what are the things that kind of speak to you, and what does it sound like and look like to you when we think about instructional leadership? I'll give you a couple minutes for that discussion. Thank you. Thank you. I'll bring you back together now. We'll rejoin the whole group. Thanks so much. I'll give you a minute to do that. Thank you. So I'm sure you had some individual experience with instructional leadership, how difficult perhaps it's been for you to get focused uh, on instruction when all the distractors are happening. And what does it truly mean when we talk about instructional leadership? Some of the research that we turn to is John Hattie's research. And throughout all the research you look at, the belief that student learning is about what we do is strongly connected to being an instructional leader. So as leaders, we certainly have to have that belief that what teachers and leaders do or do not do is about student learning. And so we really have to understand that that focus on student learning has to be alive in all our actions and definitely in what we say, what we do, what we model, and how we set expectations up for our systems. Focusing on the impact of teaching on learning. So we're thinking about what does great teaching look like? What does it look like and sound like when we go in a classroom and we know learning is taking place? We've talked a lot about culture shifts where teachers are not just teaching and covering curriculum, but where we have schools and systems in place where it is about what's being learned. And so we're focusing more on learning rather than on covering content and covering curriculum and getting that impact understood. We want to make sure that we're asking students to work at grade level. We want to maximize student outcomes to make sure that we're setting challenging targets. So we don't want to be teaching below student expectations. We don't want to be assessing below. And so really understanding what the work should look like when it's proficient and what it looks like and should sound like when students are able to do that. We want to see assessment as part of feedback on adult actions. So Hattie talks a lot about seeing that feedback loop and that student feedback and teacher feedback is really holding up a mirror and understanding what it looks like when adults are impacting the learning. And we understand that that feedback is important both to students and to adults. We talk about student learning when we think about evaluating staff members' impact. And so we think about what great instruction is based on how much students are learning. We don't just think about the teacher with the tidy classroom or the teacher that presents well, or knows how to come to all the extracurricular activities. We really want to be thinking about that staff member's impact on student learning, and that the job of a teacher is really that first, is to make sure that we're growing students. And that we're understanding the importance of listening to student and teacher voices. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well in this presentation, but getting very clear on what you see and what you hear from students and teachers when they talk about teaching and learning, when they think about student learning. And then lastly, that we're creating that environment where it's safe to learn from errors. It's safe to make mistakes. It's safe to have productive struggle. All those pieces are important in that learning environment. And so these create that environment and certainly the pieces around instructional leadership that we want to build in our systems. Every student deserves a great teacher. And so when you think about this, it shouldn't be by chance, but by design. We don't want teaching to be a lottery for a student. We don't want students to come to school hoping to get a great teacher. We don't want a parent hoping to get the right teacher. We truly want to create equity around the opportunities for students to learn. We want to create equitable access to curriculum, equitable access to great instruction. And so as instructional leaders, as everybody in the system working together, we truly have to design this and not just expect it to happen. So in Leading with Intention, when Jeannie and I co-authored this book, we focused on 8 areas of leadership focus. And chapter 1 starts our conversation around intentionality. And that theme does weave all the way through the other 7 chapters. And so right now I want to share a little bit from chapter 1 with you, because when I'm doing leadership coaching and working in schools, districts, and certainly at the government level, we see the need to build more intentionality around the right work. Often the coaching cycle brings us back to this. So sometimes principals have the best intentions when school starts, and it doesn't take very long for the distractors to play out and for the work to not look quite like they planned it to look. And so Jeannie and I talk a lot about the times where we're doing leadership coaching, where we've had to bring people back to that intentionality. And so we see that that's what separates effective leaders from ineffective leaders through our coaching, is that ability for the leader to stay focused on the right work. So when we think about staying focused on instruction, staying focused on having that feedback loop with teachers, having time in classrooms to observe instruction, to support instruction, it really truly does depend on our ability as leaders to stay focused on what we've set as our priorities. We all have distractors, and definitely in schools are full of distractors. There's been so many initiatives. Sometimes it's just things that come up in communities. Several of the communities that I'm working in right now have so many outside distractors that it's really difficult for the principals and the district and division leaders to stay focused on the right work. So what are some strategies and practices that can help you do that? And so in chapter 1, there are a few templates, and we are happy to make them available to you. Jeannie and I designed a few templates that were not difficult to use, but caused some thinking, and we really did want it to be about reflection. So one of the templates that we use quite a bit in our leadership work is just getting leaders to write down what their priorities are. And I know you've seen lots of activities where you're prioritizing your work, you're setting goals in school improvement plans, but this is a little bit more about a personal reflection. When you think about what you want to prioritize in your system, in your school, what are those 3 biggest things? And this can be done in short time cycles. So you can say, you know, over the next couple months, these are the 3 things that I'm going to spend my time doing. And what we like to ask is the why. So over here in this column, we always ask our leaders to think about why they listed these priorities. So it's not just pulling things out of the air, but it makes sense to you that this is the right work. And then we want to think about how we're going to communicate these priorities. We know that it's important for leaders to have vision and to understand where they're going, but we think it's just as important for the understanding of that vision and those priorities to be known by others. And so how do you share that understanding? How do you build tight expectations and non-negotiables in your work so others understand that these are the priorities and this is how we're going to get there? What we typically see, and certainly in my work with the Learning Bar, is the focus on literacy instruction. So how are we increasing effective literacy instruction in the school? It might mean that we're creating more understanding also of how to use assessments. It might mean that we're going to set a SMART goal around reading levels. So the priorities become whatever it is for you to be more focused on that instructional piece and clearly helping you set some action plans for yourself. Then the hardest part, and I guess the challenge, you know, the struggle is real. So how do we get our time aligned with the priorities? I think of all the amazing leaders I work with and how they're multitasking all the time. Every principal I sign on with or visit at a school right now is dealing with so many things. Schools have opened again. We have so many activities happening that we haven't seen for 3 years. We have sporting events, and we have community events, and we have musical events. And at the same time, we're trying to build capacity around academics. We know that there's learning gaps. And the principals that I work with understand that that's a priority, but getting their time set there so they're really, truly supporting teachers and student learning, that is the struggle. And so acknowledging that struggle is important with anyone you work with. We cannot pretend it's not happening. especially if we're system leaders and we're adding to the plate, we're adding more and more requests of those principals. I think lots of times we have to really think about where we're asking them to spend their time. And so throughout any system, we can develop more practices around this, and we can develop more strategies to manage it. So one of the ways that Jeannie and I suggest in our book is just to start to think about what you said in that previous document that were your priorities. And now let's think about giving ourselves basically a score. So we built a little rubric. And again, it's meant to be self-reflective, but actually taking those 3 priorities and then spending some time thinking about, perhaps at the end of a week, actually, how have you done? Have you spent any time around those priorities? And then you can give yourself a score. 1 being, you were totally distracted and it just didn't happen, to 5 that you actually can see in your actions that you were aligning your time to what was most important. So these are just samples of ways that build that self-reflection into leadership, but also help us think about ways to improve our instructional focus. A little cheat sheet that we made up is just a simple strip that you can have in a clipboard or carry with you. And we have lots of principals and district leaders that use this. They write down one thing they're going to do, they put it in here, and they actually log what happens. So the sample that we provide is that the intentional focus of a principal is to get to a classroom and to see small group instruction. So very intentional focus on knowing what they want to see when they go to the classroom. And then they have another teacher come to the office and ask if they have a minute to talk. And I think we all know what happens when we hear the, do you have a minute to talk? It definitely isn't going to be a minute. And we really truly have to decide then if it's an emergency, if it's something that has to happen, and how we handle this becomes how we intentionally keep our focus on what we want to work on. And so we use this little strip to help principals and leaders just kind of practice this. So the intention is there, the distractor happens, what do you do? So in this case, the principal did explain to Mr. Smith that he planned to go to a classroom and that if it wasn't an emergency, basically, that he would see him during his prep time. And so this is where lots of times we're creating a little bit of an issue for ourselves in not being able to stay focused. And I mean, you can use this in your personal life as well, obviously. We have the best intention, and as lots of us say, the squirrels kind of happen, or we get distracted pretty easy and we don't stay where we meant to be. And so as simple as these sound, it's quite complicated when we're actually implementing that intentional focus as educational leaders. And then the last one is really just a time log, and you can do this anytime, but we've set it up for a 3-day spread that you basically list out what you want to do over the next 3 days. Where do you want to spend your time? So if it's visiting literacy lessons, it's being in collaborative team meetings, it's being doing a little bit of PD with teachers. You list out your pieces that are the most important pieces to you, and then you actually log your time over 3 days to see if it mapped out. And there are lessons to be learned in how we're juggling our time, obviously, and which distractors we're allowing to pull ourselves away. So those are just some tools that we'll happily share with you, but you certainly can create your own, anything that's going to help you build a little bit more focus on where you want to spend your time. So again, let's take a couple minutes just for reflection. How can taking the time to prioritize and focus on instruction aid your leadership? So where do you think that matters the most to you right now in your practice? And where are your challenges? We know there are challenges. We're not going away from this saying it's easy to do, but where are the challenges, and where do you think you could kind of build some better practices in to spend more time in that instructional focus? So a few minutes for discussion. All right, I'll bring you back together. I know there is never enough time for our conversations, and hopefully throughout the day, you'll be able to continue these conversations with each other and think about your impact on balancing everything and certainly getting clear on your focuses and priorities around instructional leadership. Our Canadian friend Michael Fullan, in a book that we've all used, I'm sure, and it's not a new book, but definitely continues to come back when I think about building successful change and building great leadership as we build change practices. And when he listed these 10 elements of successful reform, several of them come glaringly out to us about instruction. And so he talks about having a small number of goals so that prioritizing and being very intentional as leaders is truly important. And then he takes 4 and 5 and focus them clearly on instruction. So building capacity as leaders, so that collective capacity, helping others understand what it means to have a focus on instruction, how to have conversations focused on instruction, and then of course that individual capacity building where we're truly helping grow teachers. So we're helping teachers understand and be better at instruction. We're not just hiring them and thinking that they've come with all the skills, that we're going to build practices and really help others see what good instruction looks like. So our tight expectations are not just expectations, but we're building capacity while we do that. And then of course, he talks about being vigilant about distractors. And so having any strategies in your toolkit that you can have to keep the distractors at bay is going to be critically important. And then, of course, we need to have intentional conversations about instruction. So we need to continue to find the time, we need to find the ways, we need to help others understand and build that shared understanding of what instruction looks like. I know I've said that a few times already, but it's critically important that it isn't just something we desire to see happen, that others see it as a priority and understand it. So how do we get there when we think about instructional observations and conversations? So do we have expectations around planning lessons? And I think sometimes that we think about that, or teachers think about that as a bit of a lost art. And I've had teachers say to me, I never really plan my lesson. I just go in and I have a curriculum and I open it to page 28 and that's my lesson for the day. We really want to help teachers understand that there is planning to a literacy block. There is planning to a structured lesson, that explicit instruction needs to be well planned. And so helping others understand what your expectations are around that, and definitely helping them see where they can grow and what we need to do to help them. And then having pre-observation conversations. This seems to be a struggle time-wise for a lot of the leaders I work with, but I think it's truly important for teachers to be part of the conversation about what you're going to observe. So asking teachers what they would like you to come in and observe. What part of the lesson's the most important part for you to give them feedback on? Or asking them intentionally, when is this going to happen in your lesson? So I'm sure to be there. Knowing that sometimes you'll need to see the entire lesson to understand the teacher's strategies and the flow, her pace, his pace, but other times you may just want a snapshot of a piece of a lesson. And then really having those intentional conversations about what you want to look for. So what are you going to focus on when you go into a classroom with intentionality? I think we've come so far from the days when I was observed as a teacher, and I would just get feedback on things like the tidiness of my room or how my bulletin boards looked. I remember one time a principal telling me that the coats were not hanging correctly on the coat rack. I didn't have order enough, I guess, in my coat rack. And that was the only feedback I think I ever got from that principal. So we really want to be crystal clear what we're expecting, but also help teachers understand those look-fors. And then spending time in post-observation conversations. I work in a lot of systems now where principals and district leaders go in and they do focus walks and they have a document on their iPads or tablet that they can give feedback right away to teachers. They're filling out a document as they're in the classrooms. And some of the people I work with have a good way of managing that, and that seems to work for teachers. But for a lot of teachers, they're going to need a conversation. And I try to help my principals see the importance of spending a little bit more time here. So what are those questions that will guide your conversation, and how do you really think about that as a leader? And then definitely doing some follow-up. So are you going to ask a teacher to do something different? Do you want to go back in and see that? Making sure that you do your follow-up and you continue to progress monitor what you want to see improve. It's that balance of pressure and support. And so making time, again, finding the time out of your busy day to spend more time intentionally with classroom instruction is going to increase your instructional leadership and definitely help improve and grow students. So it doesn't matter where we look at research. We've looked at a couple pieces today, and we certainly have Dr. Wilms with us. And there's a lot of research around grade instruction now, but without that focus on instruction as a leader, it is really going to be difficult to have schools improve. It just does not, it does not sustain change, and it does not take and grow the adults or the students the way you want them to. So we're talking about moving out of management. We're talking about getting better at sharing leadership. So helping others, as Michael Folan said, have that capacity building, thinking about we're building human capital. We want to share what we expect. We want to share how we want to work. We want people to understand, and we want to grow other leaders. And then really being, again, intentional and building those tight expectations on everything that we're trying to improve. And so not having 100 tight expectations, but having a small list of things that are non-negotiable that are focused on instruction. I don't think we can say enough about collective teacher efficacy. When we talk about self-efficacy, we're talking about teachers becoming more confident. So they're learning to be better at their craft. They're feeling more confident, and they believe in themselves. So they become better at their own belief in students. So as we build self-efficacy in teachers, we're seeing that confidence grow, and we see the belief in students and their ability to engage those students in learning truly take off. And that's that capacity building, shared leadership, understanding what good instruction looks like, and supporting that work. And then when we do it collectively, so we're building collaboration, we're helping teachers write SMART goals together, we're helping teachers plan lessons together, we build that shared ownership for all of our students. So it isn't my child, it's our children. It isn't my school, it's our school. It isn't my class, it's our students. And as we build teacher efficacy, we see our work grow. And that is one of the highest effect size with John Hattie's research continues to be around this collective efficacy. I do a lot of work with professional learning communities, and we just see schools improve when the implementation is done with fidelity and principals understand the importance of this collective teacher efficacy. So it goes a long way in building that shared leadership, and certainly your instructional leadership can benefit from this as well. So we're building some key leadership areas, and one of the other ones that I want to talk a little bit about right now is the evidence-based decision. So moving a little bit from, we're going to be intentional in our focus on instructional leadership, but what does it look like when we actually know what the evidence of that is? And how do we truly become more evidence-based when we think about planning our priorities and planning our actions and progress monitoring what those tight expectations are? So we do a lot of work especially with our literacy focus and confident learners, by asking teachers to think about student by student, skill by skill work. So as leaders, we want to be guiding questions about what are those essential foundational skills that we want students to know and be able to do, and how are we going to formatively assess them? So how we're going to continue to check for understanding, how we're going to understand what each student can do, and what those basic foundational skills are that we need to really, really progress monitor. And so getting really good at that student by student piece is what we do when we do our work in confident learners, and truly try to build the leadership capacity within our schools. And so we're right now using para data with our confident learners program. And so when the teachers, the principals, the system leaders get the reports, one of the reports they get is this class report, and it truly does very clearly help teachers see what challenge their students are on, how they're doing, what they've mastered. And we have, I guess I'm going to say cleaned it up to the point that the report gives very, very good information about what do I do next for students. So when we think about evidence-based decisions, teachers, principals, and system leaders can very quickly think about what are my instructional decisions? What do I want to do next instructionally, because I see in the data that that's going to really move our students forward. And so we've seen in the different systems we're working, we've seen the students move quite quickly and definitely progress. We want to move students emerging out of that baseline. So we're continuing to progress monitor that. And so again, as an instructional leader, we're able to use evidence of progress monitoring to talk about what do we do next in certain schools, what do we do next in certain classrooms, how do we support a teacher differently, how do we support a collaborative team differently, using that evidence to really drive our instructional leadership conversations. And we see that growing every single day in the systems we're working in. And so as leaders, we progress monitor by collecting evidence and artifacts. So we're always thinking about what's that evidence and the artifact's going to tell us. So we want to be accountable for our work, but we don't want to just collect data to collect data. It's got to have an instructional message. We have to learn something from it, and it should drive our next steps. We want to continue to think about having bigger data discussions. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes, but how do we build in times where we're humanizing our data? We're thinking about data more in the stories and the quantitative pieces as well, and that we're taking this out to community. So how can we hold more discussions about what we expect and where we truly are? And then continuing to build that collective ownership, as we talked about before, and definitely ensuring that we have the resources in place. So it's one thing to have high expectations for improved instruction, but if we're not supporting that with coaching or training or professional development or conversations, feedback, then it's really tough to expect it to happen. And so our progress monitoring as instructional leaders has to kind of be a menu of ways that we build our practices and help others understand. A book that so many have been reading this past year or so is Street Data. And one of the things I really like about this way of thinking about data is that humanizing piece. And so thinking about data not as those big benchmarks and the end story that we're waiting for, and we're hoping for things to get better when we do a great big data dump later in the year. It's really about the conversations and the stories and the ways that we're really understanding, in my opinion, where student learning is on a daily basis, where adults are in their thinking around student learning. And so we're really trying, through the street data approach, you're really trying to seek data from other places, at that ground level where you're walking around a classroom and you're seeing the student work. You're having conversations with high school students. You're having conversations with elders. You're meeting in community. You're talking to more teachers about what's the stress level. We're working in a lot of schools right now where attendance is still not great, and there are a lot of stress points. Mental health definitely has been an adult and student issue in all the schools I work in, and the communities are suffering. And so that community is part of what happens in your school or in your system. And so helping leaders understand that all of the conversations, all of the ways that you can sort of see the story in the student learning and see the story in the adult learning is going to build your capacity to have evidence. It may not look like the exact same evidence when we think of that great big provincial assessment a certain month of the year, but it definitely is the continuous story of student learning. And so there's so many things that we can bring to the table when we think about being instructional leaders that can build a little bit more relationships focused and definitely help others see that we are interested in understanding. And so, as Stephen Covey said, it's really about we seek to understand first. And so I think the street data focus, or any kind of way that you're looking at quantitative data as well as qualitative, helps us become better listeners and definitely learners of that understood piece. So we're understanding, and then we move forward with our actions because we truly see the picture. And jumping the gun and making decisions and actions without that kind of evidence or those stories understood really doesn't set us up for the same kind of success that we want to have in our school improvement work. So I'm going to take a breath and let you talk again for a couple minutes. What are some next steps for you to become more student focused? How might you become more student focused? And just kind of think about using evidence to do that. Does it, where can you see some places that you could do a little bit of tweaking and possibly bring some improvements to your work? All right, I'm going to pull you back together as a big group and we'll just finish up. I just want to end with a couple thoughts around building community and what it takes to build community as we think about that qualitative approach. And so we want to always be pulling our community into our systems in our schools, but we also want to be taking learning out to our communities. And so doing more community outreach as leaders is always a really good place to spend time. But we want to be thinking about it as well as how do we have conversations, taking it to the street, perhaps, as you think about street data, but how do we have more conversations about student learning? How do we help others understand the value in coming to school and learning to read and being in class and being being a participant? So doing more community outreach or thinking about how we honor the community, having more conversations about attendance right now seems to be a place to start, but definitely about student learning and that student achievement. So can we share our success as we grow students with the community? Can we have them more part of our communication plan, I guess I'll say, and understanding the work that's taking place in our buildings? All of that adds value, but it also helps build your instructional leadership as you think about that bigger picture. So as Brene Brown says, it's clear as kind and unclear as unkind. And sometimes we assume others understand and we don't spend the time building that communication plan. So really thinking about bringing clarity to our work so others truly understand what it means to be student focused and definitely an instructional leader. So at this point, I'm going to just close by asking you to consider that every choice you do make is a choice of intention. And where we spend our time is a choice, if we focus on instruction as a choice, and if we truly deliver a priority to others that is going to have an impact is really a choice of ours. So I welcome any of your questions and comments. I look forward to hearing from you. I would like to give you my email address so you can reach out if you'd like to, and really truly think about what will you do next? What would be some next steps for you to grow your own practice and help yourself focus on instructional leadership in a way that truly does help you grow and help others grow around you. So thank you so much for your time today. And hopefully there's time for questions in the room, or conversations, I should say, more time to discuss some of those questions that I put up for you. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.